This whole dynamic seems to take hold of people so that they are scared to death of saying what's on their mind, thinking out loud. And that is very dangerous for a civil society.
Welcome back to Gen Z Unplugged. We are so excited to have you all with us again today. We have a really interesting conversation with Stella Morabito. She has written her book on the weaponization of loneliness, and she is also a former CIA analyst. So it's a really cool topic, a great conversation, and hope you guys enjoy today's episode.
Stella, thank you so much for coming on Gen Z Unplugged today. It has been such an honor to meet you over the past few minutes of just getting to know you. You have more energy than most people my age, so it's exciting. I think if more people your age had the energy that you have and the passion for freedom, I think our country would be in a lot better shape. If you don't mind sharing with our audience a little bit about yourself, you have a book, The Weaponization of Loneliness. We have it sitting in front of us. Share a little bit about yourself. You worked for the CIA during Ronald Reagan's presidency. You have a lot of experience in just the weaponization, the strategic weaponization of loneliness throughout our country and throughout many different communist countries. So if you don't mind sharing a little bit about yourself, your book, how you got involved in what you're doing today.
Well, thank you so much, Hannah. It's great to be with you today, Catherine, too. The book is a lifetime in the making for me. I actually looked at these phenomena, what I call the weaponization of loneliness, the uses of isolation as a both social and political weapon, ever since I was a child on the playground, actually. I mean, if you go way back, I've always kind of taken mental notes of bullies and bystanders and what's going on there and what did I ever do to you? You know, why people behave the way they do. And then I saw those same dynamics throughout my life, looking at it, dealing with maybe a toxic boss or, mean girl, diva, something Gen Z might be familiar with. And then all the way up through looking at the dangerous cult leaders who use that isolation as a political weapon, like Jim Jones and Jonestown. And then as I studied, I have a graduate degree in Russian and Soviet history, especially Stalin's reign of terror, and how in totalitarian systems, this whole dynamic seems to take hold of people so that they are scared to death of saying what's on their mind, thinking out loud. And that is very dangerous for a civil society. And so this whole thing came to me all throughout my life.
That's very impressive. And your book thesis is like the weaponization of loneliness is something that I think is so important, but not talked about enough. And I would just like to kind of hear about your experiences. What is the weaponization of loneliness? What is the history of this? And just kind of hear, I mean, you're so, very well understood and learned in this subject, an expert at it. So I just kind of love to hear the history, how we've kind of seen this throughout different administrations, as well as the history of America. Right. Just kind of love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I think that this fear of being socially rejected, this fear of ostracism, is really key to understanding so much of what goes on around us. I think it actually affects what people say, what they do, what they think, and who they associate with. I think it drives so much in human affairs. And having studied totalitarian systems, you can see how that is the number one tactic, the number one weapon of any tyrant, is to get people isolated. You know, whether the tyrant is just on a one-on-one dysfunctional relationship, where the word gaslighting comes from, or like I went through that list, a toxic boss or a cult leader. Number one is to get people isolated so that they feel all alone. And you do that through propaganda and censorship, especially if you're dealing with, whole society. And so when you ask about the history, and modern history, I mean, we can go back to, the French Revolution. I have a thesis called The Machinery of Loneliness, that has three basic components. Identity politics, political correctness, and mob agitation. I think they all work together and have always worked together, even though they didn't call it that during the Jacobin reign of terror in the French Revolution, but then going on to the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and of course, Nazi Germany, and then, Mao's Cultural Revolution, really murderous Cultural Revolution that really used this fear of being isolated through the struggle sessions. I don't know if you've probably read about those sorts of things where people were humiliated publicly, and very violent use of youth. Again, this is focused on Gen Z, and something I like to bring up is that youth in particular, and I think also women, but young women in particular, are used as fodder, have often been used as fodder to push these kind of totalitarian agendas forward, what we call today woke agendas. Make people think that there's some kind of social reject if they don't go along with it. It goes way back. I kind of trace modern history, but you can go back to the Garden of Eden and see, how isolation is used as a social weapon. I mean, Eve, right? Mm-hmm. She was isolated. The serpent got her while she was, separated from her husband at a moment. And it's the same thing. And biblically, you'll see it. So it's ancient. It's a very ancient weapon. And that's because I believe we are hardwired as human beings. We are created to be in communion with God and communion with one another. And when there are walls built between us, we can't function. Many times we can't even survive. So that's kind of the gist of it.
Yeah, you mentioned youth and how they specifically, especially under Mao's Cultural Revolution and even under the Bolshevik Revolution, you see a lot of just kind of like the hypersexualization. You've seen this throughout history in countries where they want to create isolation, create loneliness among young people. They use that through sexual content. We see that today with the average age of a young person looking at pornography being age 11. I mean, by the time someone reaches 18, 90% of 18-year-olds, 18 to 25 have looked at some type of pornographic material. Mm-hmm. So I want you to kind of talk about that, like how they have used, specifically in America, this hypersexualization of youth, of children in our society to kind of isolate them, but also just confuse them on their identity and their role.
Oh, yes. I mean, and this whole issue with gender ideology, with the sexual revolution, ultimately, and I do have a chapter in my book where I go into a lot of that, is pretty much designed to pull us apart under the guise of keeping us together, right? And so young women, particularly young women on college campuses, fall victim to that. And of course, it's even worse when you're dealing with children who are confronted with pornography or even being deliberately confused about their bodies and even taught to hate their bodies. I mean, it's really criminal when you think about what happens through the whole issue of what they call gender affirming care. You get a lot of these euphemisms going on, but it just, what it adds up to is, it can add up to mutilation and, the whole thing with hormone, what do they call it? Suppressors.
Yeah, it's castration. I mean, they're castrating children.
So, and then what happens? I mean, it's just awful. People get invested in that identity, very deeply invested, because there's no way out. They're trapped once they accept it. Although detransitioners are starting to come out of the fold and, and make it giving rise to a new attitude towards how we can deal with these sorts of things. And that's basically by talking about the dangers of them, which people have been so afraid to do. But you mentioned, the hypersexualization and what happens in particular with social media and the internet. You two didn't grow up when there was no internet. Yeah. You are, it's just part of your life. But what has happened is that there's less and less contact just in terms of real life conversation, real life getting to really know people. And so again, the hypersexualization kind of tries to puts the kibosh on that, on getting to know other people as human beings, as distinct and unique human beings. And when I mentioned before the machinery of loneliness, identity politics is meant to basically erase us as unique individuals with unique personalities, sense of humor, unique experiences, sufferings, all of those things that go into a unique person. That gets all erased in identity politics. I mean, now with the woke thing, you're this or that, you're an oppressor or a victim, and that theme runs through everything, like a class consciousness and the Marxist revolutions. If you are the higher class, you get erased as an oppressor or a non-person. So it has a very old history, and then political correctness is meant to induce self-censorship so that we are fearful of saying what we think, even though a lot of people around you may be thinking exactly the same thing. It's meant to cut off that conversation, which of course is so harmful for tyranny, to have people actually talking to each other and developing really healthy relationships. So I probably didn't answer your question in the entirety, or maybe overdid it there, but I think that this issue has caused so many mixed messages, so much confusion. And I think it's up to a lot of people who have the advantage of strong faith communities, strong families, strong friendships to kind of lead the way in speaking openly, to help embolden those who do feel the same way to speak out as well.
Yeah. That's a totally good point. I like what you said about the family unit, that family sphere being the foundation for individuals, especially young women and young people today, to have strong family connections, which will give them the ability to have strong relationships with them, a good father, a good mother,
yes,
which will give them the impact and the practice that they'll need for their future with peers, classmates, bosses, like you mentioned. And I think something that's very interesting, going back to your point of social media, we did a stat here at the center with over 800 young women, and I believe it was 40% of young women labeled themselves as liberals, but their conservative values like family, motherhood, freedoms, they were all conservative values that they believed. But yet when they had to choose between conservative and liberal, they chose the liberal. And it's very interesting to me because I think that's a fear tactic. Calling yourself a conservative amongst peers, or calling yourself, that it ostracizes you in a way.
Yes.
And it really causes people to be fearful of, telling the truth and how they actually feel. We see that with previous administrations during voting. Friends would lie to one another.
Yes.
About who they voted for, and at the end of the day, we get the actual stats of, the percentages of young women who they voted for, stuff like that. So it's really interesting how social media allows people to hide behind their devices, hide behind their phones, be someone that they're not. Doesn't allow them to have conversations with one another.
Right.
But in your aspect and in your understanding of this, how can someone who is exposed in this social media world, who is just enveloped by that, how can they break out of that if that's all they know? If that's all they've been brought up in? Like you said, our generation has grown up with social media and phones and devices. We get anything at the snap of our fingers. We're able to find anything. So what would your advice be? How would you break out of that that loneliness, that weaponization that power elites are using? What would you say to those people?
Well, if those people happen to have, the strong bonds that we were talking about, I would say one thing you need to be very aware of is that self-censorship is extremely dangerous. What happens if people are following the cues of others around them. They're what we call reference group or peer group, and they don't want to get cast out. And then so they go along with it, even to the point of lying about what they believe. What happens there is something extremely dangerous that I think everybody needs to be aware of, and that's in part a huge reason why I wrote this book. There's a model called the spiral of silence it's based on a book written by Elizabeth Noel Newman that was published in 1980, and she was a public opinion expert at the University of Chicago. And one of the things she stressed was that public opinion really depends on who talks and who keeps silent. And when you get an opinion cascade that can get reinforced by left-wing media, left-wing academia, and everything else, and people are fearful of expressing what they really believe. And this is something we need to really understand, is what happens is that a really logical opinion that's actually a majority opinion can get pushed to the fringes. It can look fringy, whereas a really fringy opinion ends up looking mainstream because it keeps getting regurgitated by the propaganda press. And so we saw this probably most prominently in the whole transgender phenomenon, right? Transmania just kind of took over in 2014, 2015, because you had certain people leading the way. Now, with the women in sports issue, the only reason there's pushback on that is that there were some people who had, a lot of public, that were very high in the public eye, like J.K. Rowling, who wrote the Harry Potter books. And when she spoke out about it, she got a lot of pushback, but she held her ground. And look where we are now. Even in the UK, they're dialing this back. And Riley Gaines, the swimmer, the college swimmer, she put up. There were gangs of trans gangs or whatever you want to call them when she was speaking at a campus, basically trying to attack her. And she could have decided not just forget it, like a lot of celebrities do. You'll see this. It's such a powerful impulse to conform and comply with a lot of these things. So what would I say? That's getting back to your practical question. So if it's somebody who does have strong relationships to fall back on, they need to learn to kind of put their toe in the water and speak out just one-on-one maybe with people that implicitly trust them. And a lot of times you can find that can build a domino effect. If somebody, they don't know where you stand, but they implicitly trust you, three things, I've often said this, can happen if you go out there and say, politely, if a subject comes up, you say, I'm on the other side of the fence when it comes to that. You can either embolden a like-minded thinker. I can tell you there are times where people have whispered to me, oh, yeah, I'm with you. Yeah. But they don't want to say anything publicly, right? And there's a lot more of that than you realize. And the second thing that could happen is you've influenced a fence sitter. And the third thing that can happen is the one that everybody's afraid of. And the person says, ooh, I didn't know that you were a bigot or, whatever. But having expressed yourself, even one-on-one in that way, does something extremely powerful. It waters down the stereotype that's associated with that viewpoint. Maybe in that one person, they met somebody who, said something that maybe they didn't feel they agreed with. But that's the kind of advice I'd give to someone who had strong family and strong friendships of people that they could fall back on. Now, for people who don't have that, I think it really requires those of us who have, who have escaped that brokenness to lead the way. And the way to best start leading the way is one-on-one. kind of an asymmetric warfare when you're dealing with totally corrupted media and all the rest of the institutions. But that's the way it has to be done.
Yeah, I want to go back to girls' sports for a second because you mentioned Riley Gaines, and we've had Paula Scanlon speak at several Loose Center events, but you look at the girls' sports issue specifically, and with the weaponization of loneliness, you have psychological warfare being used.
Yes.
And you look at even the bathroom situation where you've got the University of Pennsylvania telling Paula Scanlon and her teammates that were sharing a bathroom 18 times per week with William Thomas, not Leah Thomas, William Thomas, this is his name. He's a dude, posing as a woman, dressing up, putting on a womanhood. Goes into the bathroom, and they're obviously, even some of the liberal girls are like, wait a second, we're having to compete against him, but we're having to watch him undress, and he's watching us undress. Right. So some of them, even the liberal ones, start speaking up against it, and the faculty, the professors, the coaches said, if you dare speak up about this issue, you will lose opportunities. If you dare speak out about this, you will regret it. Right. And you look at, I'm sure you're familiar with the former KGB informant Yuri Bezmenov.
Oh, yes.
Who warned us in the 80s about the psychological warfare, the demoralization of society that would happen if we allowed them to continue propagating these ideas and using fear, especially in young women. So talk about that for a second, because that specifically was used very apparently with the girls' sports issue.
Oh, yeah. And, I think that if you look back, maybe, I think it was 5 or 6 years ago before J.K. Rowling came out, and of course, Riley Gaines after that, if you look at what happened, say, this high school in Connecticut, there was a high school in Connecticut that had, there were slots for 6 athletic scholarships for young women. And I think it was a lot of different high schools. It was statewide. And there were 2 men, or young men, who took 2 of those scholarships. They took the scholarships, they took the trophies, and the young girls were just, There was one who who taught, I think with her mother, talked about it, but was brutalized at the time for doing that. But most of the girls, there's a high level of a trait called agreeableness among women, and young women in particular, that make them more susceptible to conformity, because women in particular, they don't have the strength of men, so they deal, their strength comes from social connections. And so these young women, these girls were just, okay, they didn't like it, but they kind of went along with it. And so eventually, though, as we saw just, this past year, things really started turning around. But it only happens through leadership. It only happens when someone says the emperor has no clothes. It's not going to happen when everybody oohs and ahs over the man who's crowned Miss America or whatever. It's going to happen really through not being fearful of speaking what you know is true and what everybody around you knows is true. So, that's an excellent, I think, example of how easily we can get pulled into that trap.
Interesting, yeah. And getting back to kind of the idea of the weaponization of loneliness and the fear tactics that governments can kind of use on citizens. Going back to COVID, I think was something very big.
Yes.
Back in 2020, and your book's written in 2022. So that connection with your ideas and your philosophy and how you kind of see it's so prevalent in today's society. With COVID, we had, 6 feet social distancing, we had masks. Yes. People weren't able to communicate face-to-face interactions.
Right.
No one can meet communities, groups were shut down, you couldn't go to church anymore.
Yeah, it was horrible.
With all of that, how do you think, can you kind of explain what you learned more about the weaponization of loneliness and your passion with that from COVID and how it was explicitly portrayed through COVID-19?
Oh, yes. I mean, what that COVID era showed us, and hopefully a lot of us have wised up to it, it was really a social engineering project. It had very little to do with, public health and public safety. It was really the first time in America, I think, that we experienced enforced isolation, deliberately enforced isolation to the extent that people were encouraged to snitch on their neighbors for having friends over. In California, the mayor was going to, he actually cut off water and power to any households that were reported to, have more than, having a quote party, more than 6 people or over. And so, and then the distancing, stay apart, and then covering your face. It was all very dehumanizing and alienating for so many people, especially those who lived alone, who couldn't get out and couldn't connect. Very damaging. I mean, Anthony Fauci, and he's on the cover of my book, wagging his finger, because it's kind of a symbol of the weaponization of loneliness. People were, I remember one time in those early press conferences where he told people not even to pet your dogs and cats, not even to pet your pets because they could have COVID in the fur or something like that. And I'm thinking to myself, so somebody lives alone, they can't even have animal companionship, right? According to this model that was pushed on us. So it was, I think, a dress rehearsal for putting into America a social credit system. And a social credit system, for those who aren't aware, is basically a system that's in place in China where your access to goods, your access to services, that means housing, even whether or not you can get on a bus or a train, depends on your social credit score, which means your compliance, your political compliance. And so that's another way to enforce, called isolation or censorship, self-censorship. I mean, people need to be aware that getting you to shut up about what you believe takes a heavy load off the top-down censors. You do all that policing work for them when you do that. So, yeah, it was really a horrid era. I mean, even the worst part of it, I think, was forcing people to die alone in hospitals, not allowing, sadistic, really. Not even if there was no COVID in either the patient or the loved one, they weren't allowed to be with one another. I think that was just, Americans should never stand for such a thing. And I think that, it was, hopefully Americans get it now. And, so that the elites who push this sort of thing can't get away with it so easily next time.
Yeah, I'm actually kind of curious because obviously COVID-19 was had a lot of curses, and we look at it and there was just so many harms that came from COVID-19. You mentioned the staying 6 feet apart, the lockdowns, the dehumanizing, putting on the face mask, which I, as a Christian, I believe was absolutely satanic. I mean, we were designed, God designed us to eat 3 meals a day, to be, in community, to have fellowship with one another. We don't hibernate in the winter like bears do. We have fellowship and companionship throughout the year. Like, we are designed for that. And so when you can't isolate people in their own home, they get confused, they get lonely, and you start to see all these things. So I'm actually kind of curious. And I have another question. I know we have to wrap it up soon because we could talk about this for hours with you. I mean, there's so many examples throughout history. But I think COVID-19, because it wasn't just in America, this was global. Global, absolutely. Where everyone across the world was really able to see what in the world the World Economic Forum. People finally started watching their videos from the 1990s of when they were saying this stuff, talking about 2030, 2020, when, they had Project 2022 and Project 2020 that nobody really knew about. Nobody knew that COVID-19 was talked about years before February of 2020. And so people really finally started researching and watching these videos and waking up. So I'm actually kind of curious, do you believe that while COVID-19 had some curses, and it was, obviously a stain, it left a stain on our society, do you also believe it maybe was a blessing to kind of wake people up, in a sense, to all of this corruption and this isolation, these fear tactics that are happening across the world?
Oh, from time to time, a wake-up call is absolutely necessary for survival. And I think you're right. I think that in a way, it was good because it woke up so many people to a lot of the harms that were caused. And the reason I wrote the book, of course, was to make people more aware of how this dynamic operates, not just across society at large, but begins within each one of us. And that's what, like the communications technologies we were talking about before, the excessive screen time, all of that. I think people are beginning to understand how isolation is dangerous, not only to our mental health, but to our physical health as well. I mean, isolation brings on, early onset Alzheimer's. It can bring, it's connected with, a lot of diseases, and a lot of things can be alleviated. A lot of that kind of damage can be alleviated through a sense of connection, through a joyful sense of connection with friends and family. And when you are separated from that, I think people are beginning to realize how dangerous it all is. And my book, I really want people to understand the dangers of self-censorship, how that can lead to that spiral of silence that makes everybody think that a purely logical connection, a purely logical opinion or viewpoint is somehow fringy, whereas something really fringy is somehow mainstream. This is how, public opinion can be manipulated through the manipulation of each one of us psychologically. And so, yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Nice, yeah. And before we wrap up, what is a message that you would kind of give to the Gen Z audience, maybe young women, especially who are going through this? What is the solution, even if they aren't going through this fear of loneliness? Maybe they do have the courage to speak out. What's the solution of this bigger problem, and how can people work towards combating this weapon?
Okay, well, I think, becoming aware of how it works on us and within us is absolutely key. And the message I would have, I guess, for Gen Z is just to, build your awareness of how easily, ask yourself, whenever you have that fear of speaking out, and everybody has their own threshold as to whether or not they can do that, but we need to all work on putting our toe in the water if it's not something that we want to do, because you can't get in the habit of lying about what you believe. Because once you do that, what you believe ends up being a fringy, idea according to so-called public opinion or popular opinion. And be aware that real life connections, real friends, family, there's no substitute for that. A lot of young women, hang on to these sort of celebrity idols, and they end up thinking, well, they take their cues from them and think that in order to be accepted socially, they have to agree with how to vote, what to wear. If nobody got a tattoo, they wouldn't be getting tattoos, right? If nobody got, their face pierced in 20 places, they're not going to do that. People take their cues from others, and you need to seek out these real life, real person engagements with others. Reach out more, develop your friendships, because that's really where all the real wealth is in our connections, our communion with God, our communion with one another, and that's the real treasure, and to understand that once that becomes a part of you, I think it becomes easier to kind of spread logic and love, and to spread, what's real and what's true. So I guess that's sort of that is my message, to, have a real life connections, put down the phone. Don't text someone when you're sitting right next to them. Talk to them face to face. We don't have to wear those masks,
That's right.
And so that I think it's just take joy in real life.
That's right. It's interesting. I want to get where people can find your book. I'm excited. I haven't read your book at all, but I'm gonna read it because I really appreciate you coming on the show, and I'm excited to share this episode with people that I know and my audiences as well. But I think it's interesting too. I actually want to get your thoughts before we wrap up. One more thing. you see on X, especially, a lot of these people will like tweet things to people they know. They might have met them at a conference, but they would never dare say what they said on X or respond to them online the way that, you know, they did. They would never talk to that person like that in front of them. They would never say that to their face. And these are conservatives, you know, that kind of bash each other. And I think that even plays into just this demoralization. Like, everybody's just been demoralized, but also you see such a dehumanization which came really, we were able to see it very apparently through COVID-19. And I'm curious, have you seen that as well? Maybe you're not on X as much, but maybe you are, I don't know. Talk about that for just a second, because I think we're seeing that, and then young people look at it. Young people see the adults talking to each other like that on platforms like X or Instagram or Facebook, specifically X though, that are in politics. And I had a friend, she's a mom, but she went to her son's high school and middle school, and the kids were just like, well, you're racist. Yeah. And it was like all of this name calling, because that's what they see on these platforms. And they think that this is normal. This is how they talk. But those adults would never say that in person, mostly. So,
I think you're right.
Yeah, have you seen that at all?
Well, I am on X. Stella _Morabito is my handle. But I don't really engage as much as a lot of these other people do. And yeah, I have been astonished and aghast at a lot of things I see. I mean, it's kind of like people in their cars on the interstate. I mean, they feel freer to, you know, a lot of them honk and you know, gesture, which they would never do face to face with that person. And I think there's the same kind of false insulation that people feel on social media. And that's really damaging. I think the thing to do, and I've done it in the past, maybe I should do it more often, is, you know, just come back as a reply and just say, oh, you don't really mean that, do you? Not that anybody's done it to me, not since I started, you know, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, I was writing about the whole trans issue, and man, they came down on me really, really hard. But there were times when I would reply, you don't really believe that, because they don't.
Yeah,
they don't really believe that stuff. In fact, that amazing poll that you had referred to, Catherine, showed that women that were, you know, afraid to speak out, also showed that they didn't really believe all that stuff. I think woke people, one reason they get so triggered is because they can't respond in an actual argument that's logical. And so they can't really converse. And so, you know, that's what happens is, you know, through that insulation. But I think that's you know, one of the points that we have to keep in mind is that they don't really believe that. The woke stuff, it's just an act to, in so many cases. I mean, a lot of times propaganda people internalize it and they really believe that stuff. But if everybody around them in their reference group suddenly peeled off and said, I don't think so, you think they'd go along with it? Yeah. Exactly. Because they take their cues. And so many of us do take our cues from those around us.
That's right. Ms. Stella, how can people find your book? How can they support you and see all the work you're doing?
Well, thank you so much. Well, the publisher is Post Hill Press. Bombardier Books is the imprint, but it's on Amazon. I believe there is a Kindle version as well as the hardcover. I believe in real life and paper and ink. And so if you can get the book itself and paperback, and also I have a website. Now it is a work in process right now, work in progress or process. It's called stellasbookclub.com. And it's a way that I'm trying to put together for people to form discussion groups, casual discussion groups, not only to form a sense of community, to learn about how the weaponization of loneliness operates within us and to understand these things, but to, you'd have the sense of community as well as the strength you would get from becoming more aware of these dynamics. So on that website, I have an extensive bibliography that's not just books and articles, but also movies and documentaries. Every good movie has the theme of the weaponization of loneliness buried in it. and you know, it's things for people to watch movies together or talk about certain books and articles together to develop these, you know, this awareness of how this process works within us and around us. So stellasbookclub.com. My book is on Amazon. And, you know, I hope you might pick up a copy.
I will. I appreciate you coming on the show today, and I appreciate what you're doing. Thank you so much, Miss Stella.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Catherine Hanna. It's great being here talking to you.
It's been great.